Good morning. My name is Tracy Gouch. I'm the Bacon and Pastry Arts Instructor at Lancaster County Career and Technology Center in Mountjoy, Pennsylvania. Today I am preparing a bread lesson for my students and making bread by hand as far as kneading and mixing by hand is not something we typically do in the industry because it's not really practical for large quantity productions such as would be required for a restaurant or bakery. However, my students are practicing their skills at home and making baked goods for their family, and several of them do not have mixers that are capable of handling mixing bread dough. So I wanted to share with them how to make bread dough at home by hand. Let me show you what ingredients I have here. So the recipe calls for 2 tablespoons or 1 ounce of butter. I have dissolved in 1 cup of water 2 1/4 teaspoons or 1 packet or 7 grams of yeast. I have 2 tablespoons, 1 ounce or 30 grams of granulated sugar. Salt is 2 teaspoons or 15 grams. I have 6 to 7 cups of bread flour, and I also have an additional cup of milk that I've scalded. My recipe actually calls for powdered milk, non-fat dry milk, and I don't use that at home, so I just substituted fresh milk for it. The original recipe calls for 2 1/4 cups of water and 1/3 cup of the dry milk solids. And instead of using the 1/3 cup of dry milk solids, I used 1 cup of milk because 1/3 cup of dry milk solids would make 1 cup of reconstituted milk, and then 1 1/4 cups of water. So that replaces my dry milk solid. Now I did scald the milk. I warmed it up in the microwave and let it sit until it was cool enough so that it wouldn't kill the yeast. Remember, yeast dies at 140 degrees. So I let it cool down till it was lukewarm so it would not affect the yeast. That is one of the drawbacks of using fresh milk, is that it should be scalded to kill the enzymes because that will interfere with your gluten development. So my yeast I did dissolve in my water, and my water is probably around 105 degrees, a nice temperature for yeast to dissolve in. I have my flour measured out in 2 parts, as that is the one thing I do differently when I'm kneading and mixing bread by hand opposed to in a mixer, is I start with about half of the flour, and I add my ingredients into the first part of the flour, and then I will continue to add the remaining flour as needed. All of the ingredients except for the flour has been carefully measured. However, flour is a variable because the humidity can really affect the quantity of flour that you need in bread doughs. And that's something that's specific to bread doughs. If I was making a cake recipe, I'd be very careful in my measurements of flour. But for bread doughs, it is a variable. It's easiest to start with a part of it and then to keep adding. So we typically tell the quantity of flour more so by the consistency of the dough than the amount that's in the recipe when we're making breads like this. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I'm adding my dry ingredients, except for my yeast that is in my water already. So there is my sugar, my salt, and I am going to go ahead and just mix that around. I always want to mix my salt through before adding my yeast onto it. I'm going to add in my butter, and now I'm going to add my liquids. So there's my milk, and my water and yeast is added. And I'm just mixing my dough to start incorporating the ingredients. And then I'm going to slowly start adding more of my flour. Add a cup or so. Okay, I'm going to, at this point, dump my dough out on the counter. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and start kneading by hand and adding more flour as needed. See how well I can do with my dark clothes not getting white flour all over them. I'm going to scrape up anything that's stuck on my counter so I can get that mixed in. Notice I'm constantly like folding this into the middle and then turning. If my bread is sticking to my hands, I can just add a little bit more flour. I just want to caution you on over adding too much flour. Don't want our dough to get too dry. Okay, now this process I will continue doing for probably 7 or 8 minutes or so. Just keep kneading the dough to develop the gluten. And I am adding more flour only when necessary. And sometimes it helps to take a break and wipe down your counter and get, sometimes it's sticking because of the counter has some dough stuck to it. In the kneading process, I'm folding it a quarter turn in, turning a quarter turn, folding it in, turning a quarter turn, folding it in, turning a quarter turn, folding it in, and I'm just really, that's exactly what I'm doing here, just doing a little faster. When I'm kneading, I'm constantly folding the dough in on itself to work on developing and stretching gluten strands. And I'm going to keep working on this until I see the dough become nice and smooth and elastic looking. Okay, welcome back everybody. I have been kneading this dough for a good 10 minutes now, and you can see I'm still using the same process where I'm rotating and folding it in on itself, and it definitely feels nice and elastic. I'm getting a nice smooth finish, because of the gluten development. And when I can do the window pane test and stretch it out, I'm able to start getting some thinning of the dough that I can actually, that almost looks opaque, and you probably can't see that in here, but I'm getting this opaqueness in here that's suggesting that my gluten development is good. Now I still have almost a cup of flour left in there, so I used almost 6 cups of flour in here, and I'm sure if this was in the fall when we've had a humid summer, I probably would have used a lot more of that. So again, to finish my kneading, I'm just folding in half and constantly rotating. Now I am left-handed, it may be easier for you to do it the other way. And I should have this nice stretched, smooth dough. All right, and so I'm smooth it into a nice ball. And again, just look at that nice dough. And I am going to, I washed up the bowl that I made I started my dough in, and I'm just going to spray it with hand spray. This is 100% canola oil. You can use shortening, you can use vegetable oil, anything just to keep it from sticking. And I'm actually going to drop the dough in upside down, and that helps me grease the top of the ball, and then flip it back out. And I'm going to saran wrap. Now it is a beautiful day here. It's like 68 degrees and breezy, and I have my windows open in my house. So though I'm enjoying a nice draft, the yeast in this dough will not. And what I did to help it, because I don't have a proof box right now, definitely want to make sure we don't cover it so it doesn't get dry, and also the pan spray or your shortening or your oil will also help your dough from drying out. But I actually turned my oven on. I am blessed to have a digital oven, and it will start telling me the temperature once it hits 100 degrees. So as soon as I saw it hit 101, I turned it off. And it's really important if you're going to try to use your oven for a proof box that you make sure that your temperature is really low, because if it's too hot, it's going to kill the yeast. So you want your oven to be like 100 degrees at the most if you're going to use that for a proof box. And we're going to pop this in there, and then when the oven is, you can fully touch the insides. It's not hot at all, just nice and warm and cozy for the yeast. And I'll see you in an hour. We're going to let it rise, and we'll be back for the next step. Good afternoon, everybody. We're back again. My bread dough, I just pulled it out of my proof box. My oven turned into a proof box, and you can see my dough here is doubled in size. And I just took my two fingers, and press it into the dough and make sure that the indent pretty much remains and doesn't pull back. That's a good indication that my dough is proofed and ready for the next step. So I'm just going to dump it out on the counter. And the first thing I'm going to do is cut it in half, because I have enough here for 2 loaves. So I'm going to go ahead and, if I was doing this for industry, I would be scaling it to make sure I have consistent portions. And then I am expelling the gas and also rounding my loaf. Okay. Now, I think I'm going to make one very traditional looking, and I think I'm going to braid one and put it in a pan and see what we look like. So having said that, I'm going to take this one and divide it into 3 separate portions. So I can braid this one. And again, I'm stretching the dough to make sure I have nice stretched tops. And I'm just going to let the gluten relax here for 5 or 10 minutes. And of course, always cover your dough so it doesn't get crusted over. Okay, while they're resting, I'm going to prepare my pans. I've got my mother's old loaf pans, and I'm just going to spray them with some pan spray, and you can use shortening if you choose. My dough's rested for a few minutes, and I'm going to go ahead and start making my ropes for my braids. So I'm just going to stretch out my dough. rest for a minute. Let that rest for a minute. Now I'm just going to flip this upside down. I'm going to flatten it out. And I'm just going to roll it up. I'm going to tuck my ends under. I want a nice tight stretched top, so I'm using the palm of my hand against the bottom of the counter to pinch the dough a little. And I'm just going to lay that into my greased pan, just like such. And there is my pan of bread. And I am going to, my oven I did not turn back on, but it is still slightly warmer in there than it is in my kitchen. And there was a little bit of grease on that saran wrap. That should keep it from sticking. Pop that back into my fairly warm oven. And I'm going to go back to my, just going to attach these and braid them. And then tuck the ends under and put them into my all right, here's my pan of bread. And I'm going to let these rest then for about a half hour or so to proof again. And then we'll be back to bake. And I am going to pull them out of the oven probably after 20 minutes or so I can preheat my oven. Be back in a half hour or so. Right, my bread is ready to go in the oven. I'm gently and carefully pulling the saran wrap off. And I'm doubled in size. And I'm going to pop these in the oven at 375 degrees and bake them about 35 minutes. Okay, my bread has baked about 35 minutes and it looks beautiful. I'm just put them out of the pan. Okay, got a nice hollow sound. And here's my other loaf. Again, I'm just going to let those cool down before I pack them up, and they will be tasty with dinner tonight. Now, if I wanted to, I could butter the tops. I just want to take a stick of butter and just rub over the tops. That will shine it up and make it look pretty as well. Another option if you wanted to do that instead of egg wash. And I hope you learned something and enjoy your bread when you make it. Have a great afternoon.